A couple of weeks ago, we celebrated Easter. We celebrated the astonishing, life-altering events of Easter. And we focused on the death and the resurrection of Jesus Christ. Now, this year, as we went through Easter, I was kind of drawn to looking at it and thinking, what did the disciples experience? I was drawn to contemplate what the disciples may have felt as they experienced that time. As they were approaching Jerusalem with Jesus, there was a sense of anticipation. There was a sense of anticipation because Jesus was talking about something that was going to happen, something significant, something big. But he also talked about being put to death and rising again. He talked about going somewhere and preparing a place for them. Now, when Jesus talked about being put to death and rising again, they really didn't understand what that was all about. And there were some of the close followers of Jesus who, as they heard Jesus talk about his kingdom and about what was about to happen, they began to argue amongst each other who was going to be in a place of influence and power in that special place. And so they approached Jerusalem, and then Jesus sends a couple of his disciples to go steal a donkey. Well, actually, it's really not stealing if it belongs to you anyways, and it all belonged to him. And he says if the master needs it, then they'll let him go. Anyways, so Jesus took this never before ridden foal of a donkey, and he rides into Jerusalem. And the disciples, they watch this, and they get to follow along in this parade, if you would, of a sense, where Jesus is riding in, and all the crowds are coming out, and they're cheering, "Hosanna, here's the Son of David." And as a disciple, you see this, and you think, yes, the time is coming. What Jesus is talking about, it's finally going to happen. We are going to take over the world. Not whatever their thoughts might have been. They thought it's going to happen. Jesus is going to be king. He's going to finally rescue us, and we're going to be there alongside him. And all the people recognize us. It's a wonderful event. But then as Jesus went into Jerusalem, he did what was not uncommon, went to the temple, but then he did something that wasn't common for him. Jesus wreaked a little bit of havoc in the temple. And so he certainly let them know who was in charge. And so he told them, "Why have you made this place a place where it's a den of thieves? It's supposed to be a place of prayer." Well, then as you watch Jesus, you hear him teach and through the week, and you get later into the week, and you go spend some time in the garden, which was not unusual. But what was unusual was this time Jesus seemed to be particularly in some kind of distress. And he wanted to take time to pray, which wasn't unusual, but he wanted us as disciples to pray along with him. But, we were really tired. And so we kept falling asleep. And then Jesus would wake us up and say, "Well, pray with me." And we'd fall asleep. And finally he says, "Can't you even pray with me for an hour?" But we were tired. And then finally Jesus says, "All right, let's go." And so they get up and suddenly you see, oh, here's Judas. I guess it took him a while to get here. But who's that with him? And you see Judas leading these soldiers, these soldiers coming in, and Judas comes up and he greets Jesus with a kiss, and then everything goes wrong. And you see these soldiers now, they capture Jesus, and one of you decides he's going to try to defend Jesus, but Jesus says, "Put that sword away. That's not what we're here for." And then Jesus is arrested. And the rest of you realize, hey, this is not according to plan, as far as we know. And so the disciples, they scattered. They scattered so that they would not also be arrested. Now, Peter, he was bold enough or curious enough, and he decided he was going to go check it out. But when they discovered that, in fact, well, don't you belong to this guy that we just arrested? And Peter had denied that he knew him. He swore he didn't know Jesus. And so the events happen to where you watch at a distance as Jesus goes through this mock trial. And then as he is led up to the hill to be nailed onto a cross. And I mean, Jesus has been in a place before where they tried to arrest him, and he could just walk through the crowd and nobody could bother him, right? So surely he's going to, again, because after all, he's going to rule us. He's going to lead us into freedom. So this can't be happening. And then you watch as Jesus is crucified. And even there, the others, they mock him and say, well, you can save others, save yourselves. And you think, well, won't you? I'm projecting what they might have been thinking. But Jesus died right in front of you. And you're there like in disbelief. This can't be happening. This can't be happening. And so you enter into the next day, which is the Sabbath day, in which you're not to do any work and so on, and you have all these rules surrounding it. And so you're in a complete place of darkness, of probably disbelief. Disbelief, even numb. If you've ever been through a crisis, you know that sometimes in those moments, and you're just like, this isn't real. This can't be. And so they're in that place thinking, all that we anticipated. We spent these 3 years with Jesus and all the things that Jesus taught, all the things that he did, the miracles, and we were building up to this moment. And now he's gone. What about all our hopes? What about those arguments we had about who was going to rule with Jesus? What about all that? All the experiences, the miracles, the teaching, the hanging out together, spending all that time together. It was absolutely amazing, and now it's finished. They were likely in total disbelief. Then came Sunday. The first day of the week, and so the women, they go to the tomb to finish the preparations for burial, which they hadn't got to do before. And as they come to the tomb, we read in John chapter 20. Here it talks about Mary who went to the tomb. It says in chapter 20, John 20, verse 2, so she came running to Simon Peter and the other disciple, the one Jesus loved, and said, they've taken the Lord out of the tomb, and we don't know where they have put him. And so they hear this news from Mary, and they says, are you kidding? And so Peter and John, they run to the tomb, and they get there, and it's true. The stone is rolled away. The tomb is open. They go inside, and Jesus isn't there, but the grave clothes are still there. So, that's weird. So what just happened here? And so they head back home. Now, it was bad enough that Jesus was executed, but now they've gone and taken his body away somewhere else that we don't know where it is. Later that day, there's a couple of followers of Jesus who are walking on the road to Emmaus. It says it's about 7 miles from Jerusalem. You can translate that into kilometers if you need to. And so they're walking toward this place, and the two of them are walking along and talking about what happened. And so Jesus, he catches up to them. And I'm just trying to picture the look on Jesus' face as he catches up to them. Does he kind of have a smirk on his face? I don't know. But he catches up to them, and he says to them, so what's up? He says, what are you guys talking about? And they're like, are you the only one visiting Jerusalem that hasn't a clue what's going on? And so they tell him all the events, the things that took place. And then Jesus responded, he said, how foolish are you, slow to believe what the prophets have said? And so then Jesus explained everything to them. So they're walking along with Jesus, and Jesus has been explaining this, and they have no clue who he is. Now, I kind of wonder, how can they not recognize who Jesus is at this point? I mean, they've seen him for several years anyways, and they don't recognize him. And then I thought, well, I do remember at different times I've met people out of context. As a matter of fact, we were in a small town in Alberta, and I was in this church, had been there for a couple of years already at this point, and the ladies had a tea, and so I just made an appearance to show that I was around. And one of the ladies got talking to me, and then finally she says, you don't know who I am, do you? And I says, no. She was our next door neighbor. And I'd often seen our next door neighbor, but she was always wearing her gardening outfit, whatever she was wearing. Now she was dressed up in church and was not where I expected, but I didn't recognize her. But it's very well that this was completely, Jesus was gone, so of course it's not going to be him. But anyways, so they didn't recognize who Jesus was. And so they invite this stranger in for a meal. They get to their destination, says, come on in and have a meal with us. And then as they sit down for the meal, Jesus says grace. And then their eyes were open and they recognized. And then they're like, wow, yeah, there was something there. There was something that was different when we were talking to this person. But then when they find out that who Jesus was, they're excited. And so they had to Jerusalem to tell the other disciples, to tell the other 11 who were gathered together. And they told them, it's true. Jesus is alive. We talked to him. And then after they've told them, then that Jesus showed up among those disciples and he revealed himself to them. And we read in the scriptures that post-resurrection time, Jesus showed up in different times in different places to different people. Once on the beach when he had a conversation with Peter. And at different people here and there, one time to over 500 people at once. And so Jesus did this, but it was different than it was before. Because before they would walk with him, they would get up, they'd have meals together, Jesus would teach them. But now he would show up and then he would disappear. And he'd show up to other people. So it was different than it was before. And then there was Thomas. Thomas, who has been called Doubting Thomas. He wouldn't believe until he saw Jesus for himself. You see, he wasn't there when Jesus showed himself to the disciples that first time. And he says, I'm not going to believe it until I see it, until I actually touch him. You know, in my deliberations, I've come to think that we've been wrong about Thomas. Thomas, I think, has been given a bad rap about him doubting. And as I looked into this a little deeper and thought about it, I've discovered that just maybe I want to be just like Thomas. Thinking about Thomas and thinking about the other disciples and other people surrounding the death and resurrection of Jesus, and in light of today's world in which we live, it's made me think about how we as people, how we respond to the truth. How we respond to truth, actual truth. Not some version of our truth, which has become an accepted myth in our world today. I'm completely convinced that there is such a thing as actual truth. We are a reality. We are not just some kind of virtual reality. When an event happens, there is the objective truth of what happened. Now, we likely all have a slightly different experience with that truth, whatever it may be. And we all will have probably a different recollection of exactly what happened during that time. That is probably true. But the objective reality of what happened is the truth. But how we respond to truth makes all the difference in the world. How we first accept that truth is critical. Now, I'm sure we would all say that we accept the truth when it's put in front of us. We'd probably all say, well, I'm one of those, I accept the truth when it's there. But I would venture to say that we're not nearly as interested in the actual truth as we think or say we are. Let's look back to the resurrection and death of Jesus Christ. How did people respond to the truth? How did people respond to the facts surrounding the resurrection of Jesus? Consider the Romans and the Jews. The Jewish religious leaders, they were very upset with Jesus. They were upset with Jesus because in their view, Jesus was leading people astray. And therefore, because he was leading people astray, he needed to be silenced. And they considered what Jesus was saying to be blasphemy. And according to their law, that called for the death sentence. But they were under Roman rule, so they actually didn't have the authority to put somebody to death. And so they convinced Pilate to have Jesus executed. But there was this thing that Jesus had predicted. And they were aware of what Jesus had predicted. In Matthew chapter 27, verses 62 and following, it tells us that they were concerned, these chief priests were concerned because Jesus had said that after he was put to death, he would rise again after 3 days. And so they said, and they talked to Pilate again because it was not under their jurisdiction, but they talked to Pilate and asked Pilate to guard the tomb. And so Pilate told them in verse 65 of Matthew 27, take a guard, go and make the tomb as secure as you know how. So they went, because of what they knew Jesus had predicted, they went and made the tomb secure by putting a seal around the tomb and posting a guard. So according to Matthew, then, we know what happened. Matthew says that there was an earthquake. And he says, the angel of the Lord came down and rolled back the stone and sat on it. His appearance was like lightning and clothes as white as snow. The guards were so afraid they shook and became like dead men. So what was their response to what they had witnessed and experienced? Was their expression about, like, this is amazing. You should have seen it. You should have seen what we experienced. What just happened here? We were guarding the tomb, and then this alien appeared. This alien appeared, and you wouldn't believe it. It was terrifying. It was terrifying. As a matter of fact, we were so terrified that we were completely immobilized in our fear. This dazzling creature appeared. He rolled the stone away. There was nothing we could do about it because we couldn't move. And then the tomb was open and Jesus was gone. But I guess we better go tell our supervisors. So how do you deal with this? You just witnessed literally something that was unprecedented in history. But your future, maybe even your career, is on the line. So they go tell the high priest. And so the high priest, they hear this from the guards, and they say, you mean to tell us that you were at the tomb and everything was just fine, and then shazam, all this happened? And the stone was rolled away and the tomb was empty. Really? Really? Well, I guess that means that we were wrong and Jesus was right when he did exactly what he said he would do. He did say he was going to come out in 3 days, and it happened just like that. We better respond, and we better admit it and go find this Jesus so we also can follow him. Was that the response? When they heard what had happened, when they heard the truth of what had happened, they did not like the truth. It did not fit their agenda. And so they concocted a story. They concocted a story saying, well, the disciples came and stole the body while you guys were asleep. How would you feel as a guard? You now have to go tell the story that, I fell asleep on the job. I know it's not true, but that's what they want us to say. And so they concocted the story, and they paid the guards to go and spread this misinformation. And they told them to go put it on social media, give the news feed to CBC, to Fox News, CNN, even Rebel Media, whoever you give it to. Just make sure that people out there, they hear and believe what we want them to believe what we tell them they should believe. These guards were informed, or these chief priests were informed of the truth, but they did not want the truth. It didn't fit their narrative, their agenda. The guards were eyewitnesses to the truth, but they suppressed the truth and lied about the truth for money and probably their careers. There are those then, and there are those today, who will not accept the truth. They do not want to accept the truth because it doesn't fit the way they want it to. They will not listen to anything and will do anything to try to convince others that the real truth is not the truth. Then there were the disciples. And I have to admit that I always thought that the disciples, they were quick to believe, that they believed right away. That at the tomb, when Peter and John were there, that they believed right away. That when they heard, even when the women came and told them, that they really believed it right away. But actually, it's not so. Because Peter ran to the tomb not believing what Mary had said. He had to go see for himself. Even then, according to John 24, verse 11, it says they did not believe the women because their words seemed to them like nonsense. After Peter ran to the tomb and saw the strips of linen, he went away wondering to himself what had happened. And then when those two men who had been walking on their way to Emmaus, when they came and told the disciples, we've seen Jesus, we met Jesus, he's alive. The response we find in Luke 24, verses 36 and following, it says, while they were still talking about this, Jesus himself stood among them, and he said to them, peace be with you. They were startled and frightened, thinking they saw a ghost. And I had to think, I wonder how many times the disciples thought they saw a ghost when they saw Jesus. They thought they saw a ghost. And he said to them, why are you troubled, and why do doubts rise in your minds? Look at my hands and feet. It is I myself. Touch me and see. A ghost does not have flesh and bones, as you see I have. When he had said this, he showed them his hands and feet. And while they still did not believe, they did not believe it because of joy and amazement, he asked them, do you have anything here to eat? They gave him a piece of broiled fish, and he took it and ate in their presence. He said to them, this is what I told you while I was still with you. Everything must be fulfilled that is written about me in the law of Moses, the prophets, and the Psalms. Then he opened their minds so they could understand the scriptures. Even after they saw him, they still didn't want to believe until eat some fish, and then we will know. But finally, they began to believe, to actually accept what Jesus had done exactly what he said he was going to do all along. And that was to rise again after he had been crucified. So I wonder, why are we so hard on Thomas? He wasn't there the first time they saw Jesus. We read about Thomas in John chapter 20, verses 24 and following. It says, now Thomas, also known as Didymus, one of the 12, was not with the disciples when Jesus came. So the other disciples told him, we have seen the Lord. But he said to them, unless I see the nail marks in his hands and put my finger where the nails were and put my hand into his side, I will not believe. A week later, his disciples were in the house again, and Thomas was with them. Though the doors were locked, Jesus came and stood among them and said, peace be with you. Then he said to Thomas, put your finger here, see my hands? Reach out your hand and put it into my side. Stop doubting and believe. Thomas said to him, my Lord and my God. Then Jesus told him, because you have seen me, you have believed. Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have believed. Jesus performed many other signs in the presence of his disciples, which are not recorded in this book. But these are written that you may believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name. So how different was Thomas from the other disciples? All of them didn't believe until they saw Jesus with their own eyes. But all of them, including Thomas, believed once they had proof that they had the truth. The actual truth. Not just something somebody was trying to get them to believe, but they had the actual truth. Once he encountered Jesus personally, Thomas was almost more quick to respond to Jesus than the others. He didn't ask Jesus to eat fish first. And his response immediately then was, my Lord and my God. Thomas wanted to know what was the truth. And I've been absolutely amazed over the last couple of years how many, and maybe most, people don't really care what the truth actually is. We are so much more like the chief priests than we all would like to believe. We're not nearly as interested in the actual truth as we are in what fits our chosen or preferred orthodoxy, in whatever area that might be. What we have always been taught, what has been acceptable within our chosen circle that we are a part of. In our world today, we see that in so many different ways. I mean, we are here in this world, in this universe. We got here somehow. And of course, in our curiosity, we want to figure out, how did we get here? We can't go back in time. I mean, we have some recorded history, but we can't actually go back in time. We have no videos from back then. Even AI can't come up with that. And so we got here somehow. How did we get here? And so we delve into our scientific methods to try to figure out, how did we get to where we are today? However, mostly the world around us does not want to consider that God exists and that there was any God that had any part of it. And so then we have to come up with some way and means that we got here without God. That very approach is completely unscientific. Because if we, to start with, are going to say and rule out that this is what we're studying, but we know that we don't believe this is, and so we won't even consider that. And what if we're wrong? But we're not even going to consider it. We're not going to consider that as a possible truth. We've already begun on an unscientific foundation. And so we don't want to accept that truth and consider it in our deliberations. Now, what about politics? You say, well, what does truth have to do with politics? And I'll just say, and I'll probably make somebody mad by saying this, but I have been astonished over the last 6 years where we've had a certain political person in the nation that is a close neighbor of ours that will look at people and look directly into the camera and unabashedly declare a complete lie. And people totally buy it. Because that is who they choose to believe. Probably saying, I don't care what the truth is, but this is what we're told, and so that's what I accept as the truth. Now, we would never admit that we wouldn't care what the truth is. But I witnessed it over and over. What about in our own country? In our own country, our government wants to dictate what we are allowed to believe, regardless of what truth might be. But that is the truth they want us to believe. As a matter of fact, it goes to the place where a few years ago, where we had this whole summer program thing where groups could apply for funding from the government, but you had to in fact declare this is what you believed, which was an agreement with what the government said you must believe, or else you don't receive the funding. Where the government tries to force you to believe a certain way, regardless of what truth might be. And how often we hear from those people, it's your truth, this is my truth. But what is the truth? Our government wants to determine what we are allowed to believe, no matter what is actually true. And that's not just federally, that plays all the way down to local governing bodies that we have, and be kind of a whole nebulous thing about truth in our world. Now, but lest we get self-righteous, what about the church? For almost a couple of thousand years, we've had the church leadership, or the hierarchy, if you would, tell us what we are allowed to believe or not believe. For many years, we did not actually have the Bible available to the average person. And so we were told by the hierarchy what we were to believe, what we were allowed to believe, and if we declared, even spoke that we believed something else, we were called heretics and could be executed for it. But we were told what we should believe. And then came the printing press. And some people were bold enough to give their lives so that the scriptures could be put in the common language and then printed it so that everybody could read it. And this brought about literally a reformation. And we realized that, hey, wait a minute. The Bible does not actually say some of the things that we've been taught which are critical matters in our lives. Now, we say, okay, so we're 500 years past that. Does that mean that we now accept the truth? Well, just look at the myriads of denominations in our world. Every denomination thinks they have a corner on the truth, that they are right and the other ones have it wrong, even if it's slightly wrong, but at least they're wrong and we're right. That's why we have our little groups everywhere. Recently, in a church that I was pastoring, there was an issue that came up. It had to do with women in leadership. And so in that church, we did not have women elders, and there were those that felt we should have women elders. And so this came up. It never been a congregational decision. And so this became a point of conflict. And most of the elders that were there, they very strongly had a particular point of view. And the others were saying, well, but we need to consider everybody's perspective on this thing. But they were saying, no, this is that's the right way. And so here's what we will propose, and then you will decide to agree with our proposal. And so I thought, okay, what I'm going to do is I really wasn't there to deal with this issue, but being I was there, we have to deal with this issue. And so I began to study the scriptures on this particular issue. And I read far too many books on the subject. And what I realized in my study through that time is that most authors were actually not interested in the objective truth. Most of them were only interested in confirming their particular perspective in whatever way possible. It didn't matter which side of the issue they were on. And especially the more extreme they were in their perspective, the more adamant they became that this was the place and didn't even consider what else might be truth. The elders in the church did not want anything put before the people, and so they only wanted to present one side. And I said, well, you should at least present both sides so people can have a conversation. But I had to ask the question, were we more concerned about convincing people we were right, or were we interested in actually finding out what was the truth? Some years ago, Rob Bell wrote a book called Love Wins. Some of you are familiar with the book and back in the controversy that it was, where he basically was, the takeaway we took from the book is that he was saying that in the end, God's love is so powerful that he would never send anybody to hell ultimately. Anyway, so this became a big conflict within the church, and there were churches that would forbid that material to be made available within their church. And I remember being part of one church where they refused to allow any of those materials in their library because it would present a view that they didn't agree with. And I wondered, what are we afraid of? A few years ago, actually, I was preaching on a passage that I preached on here at Powers Creek back when we were West Bank Missionary Church many years ago. And as I was preparing to preach on this particular subject, when I thought, well, I'm going to go and look back to my notes from back in the day when I preached here. And I was troubled to find what I had preached here before, back then. The Bible did actually not say what I was clearly affirming back then. Because what I was affirming back then, and I won't tell you necessarily what the subject was and when it was, but what I was affirming back then was what I had always been told was right. And what was the acceptable teaching at that time for certain people. Now, I know that as church leaders, we're trying to protect our people. And I'm not sure that we're actually protecting people when we stop them from exploring what the truth is. What if we've been wrong? And as a church, we have been wrong. You know, the world actually is not flat. Sorry, if there's any of you that believe that. All you have to do is if you ever get on an airplane and you travel somewhere and if it's flat somewhere along the way, anyways, whatever. But, you know, the thing is that the Bible talks about the four corners of the earth. How can you have four corners of the earth if the world is round? Anyways, there's all kinds of different things. And so we realize that, hey, it's talking about something different than that this is one layered sheet like a blanket and there's those corners. It means something different. You know, the universe actually doesn't revolve around the earth. What a shock to some people, because that was taught within the church. The Reformation pointed at the fact that official church teaching can be wrong. The church tradition that I was raised in, it was taught that it was sin to play organized sports. Oh. You know what? So I was not allowed to play organized sports on a team because it was wrong. It was sin. It was a sin to use musical instruments in church. It was a sin to go bowling. One time, my dad and a couple of guys he was working with, they were working out of town, and they decided to go bowling because nobody would catch them. But somehow word got back home after all. And they had to get up in church and in front of everybody confess their sin of bowling. It was a sin to wear a necktie. Now, that one I can live with. No, just kidding. And so on and so on. You see, we have been wrong. So how then should we respond? I suggest that we should respond like Thomas. To respond like Thomas and seek out the truth. What is the actual truth? No matter what we may have been taught. Now, don't throw it all out, but just because that's what I've been taught does not necessarily mean that it's the truth. No matter what tradition may have said, no matter what our superiors may tell us is acceptable, or even what we personally prefer. Now, it's not a point of being rebellious, but it's a quest for truth. What is the actual truth? You know, we don't need to fear science as long as science actually seeks the truth. And that's what it's supposed to be doing. You know, there's this whole thing called Big Bang. Big Bang what? Big Bang theory. It's a theory, right? It's their theory, and yet how often it's taught as what we might say the gospel truth. But it is still a theory. As a matter of fact, recently I read an article that Steve Hawkins, I don't know if I said his name exactly right, but he came up with this whole theory about how time began at the Big Bang. And I read recently that he actually recanted his belief about that. He says, I think I was wrong. It wasn't actually at that time, and then he had a different theory, again, as to when it began and so on. So there's these theories that people try to come up with. If there is no God, there is some kind of a theory, but it's theory. But as long as science seeks the truth, we can totally embrace it. When we study the scriptures, do we actually believe what they say? When we study them, we should look at what did they say? What did the authors intend to say when they were written? What was the intention? If God gave a specific law to Moses for the people of Israel in the Mosaic covenant, don't assume that those laws apply to you. And it's fascinating to me how we pick and choose out of there. Well, this obviously doesn't apply. This obviously doesn't apply, but for a tattoo, it does. No, anyways, but anyways, so we have all these different things that we pull out. And if God made that covenant with them then let's leave it with them. Unless if there's a principle there that's somewhere else in Scripture. Same with the promises that are made. Do we really want the truth? The chief priests did not want to accept the truth and the reality of Jesus Christ and his resurrection. They tried to suppress and misrepresent the truth. The guards, they were willing to propagate misinformation for financial gain. The disciples, they took a while, but they finally embraced the truth, even if it cost them their lives in the end. I read recently about Chuck Colson, who was involved in the whole Watergate affair. And he says, you know what? Watergate made me believe the truth of Jesus. He says, because there you had 12 of the most powerful men in the world, and they couldn't keep alive for 3 weeks. Do you think these disciples, these 11 after Judas ended it, they did not only hold it for 3 weeks, they went to their death. And most of them were killed because of their belief. What about you and I? Are we seeking the truth? Or are we like the pastor that I heard many years ago? He made the statement kind of off the cuff, and he says, I may be wrong, but I'm convinced. That's as if being convinced was more important than being right or wrong. In John chapter 8, verse 31 and 32, it says, to the Jews who believed him, Jesus said, if you hold to my teaching, you are really my disciples. Then you will know the truth, and the truth will set you free. If you hold to my teaching, Jesus said, if you hold to Jesus' teaching, then you will know the truth. Not if you hold simply to your own teaching, or not simply if you tenaciously hold to your own truth. But if you hold to Jesus' teaching and his actual teaching, then you will know the truth, the objective, unchanging truth. And then the truth will set you free. The only way that we will discover that truth is if we're willing to consider whether we are right or wrong, whether we have been right or wrong, to admit it when we are wrong, and then embrace the truth. Let's pray. Our Heavenly Father, as we bow before you here this morning, we thank you about the truth we have about you and in you. And we realize that as we look at the scriptures and as we read about the very beginnings of even Adam and Eve and how they were right from the get-go challenged with untruth, and how they chose to embrace that. And it's something that we have wrestled with all these years. And we wrestle with it in our lives today as much as ever before. Because now we have ways and means that we can communicate so that anybody can say anything about anything. And nobody really wants to believe anything except holding on to what they treasure for themselves. That speaks for ourselves. But Lord, this morning, we want to re-engage, re-embrace your truth, the actual truth. And I pray that you would work in our hearts and in our lives for each one of us, that however we wrestle with this, whether it has to do with things that we interact with our friends or with others around us, or whether it is in what we believe in our own lives, Lord, may we come back to your truth, to embrace it. And so that we might in fact be confident that this is not just one of the truths out there, but the actual truth. And so may our hearts be open to you, for you to work in our lives, and may your will be done in us as it is in heaven. And so we pray in Jesus' name. Amen.